Welcome, attendees. Thank you for joining us for this panel presented by Folk Alliance International for Folk Unlocked. My name is Amy Reitnauer Jacobs, she, her, hers, white woman with dark hair and glasses wearing a striped shirt. I'm the president of the board of directors of FAI, and I'm also the co-founder and executive director of the Bluegrass Situation. Before we begin, let's take a moment to acknowledge that we are joined today by folks from around the globe using technology that is not accessible to all. We recognize the importance, complexity, and difficulty of land acknowledgements in the context of online organizing, creation, and collaboration. We invite you to join in acknowledging our shared responsibility to use this time together well, and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and active allyship. Further, I acknowledge I am tuning in from Los Angeles, California, the traditional territories of the Kizh, Tongva, and Chumash people. We hope you'll share your own acknowledgement as well as thoughts throughout the panel in the Folk Unlocked chat. This panel will be available for viewing for the remainder of the conference once it's aired at its scheduled time. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this panel, my friend, BGS teammate, chair of the board of Bluegrass Pride, IBMA nominated recording artist, and all-around wonderful human being, Justin Hiltner.
Hello, thank you. This is Justin speaking, and I'm so grateful and honored to be here with you all today for an important discussion around accessibility. Today's panel will discuss accessibility with the goal of approaching this enormous topic with sustainable strategies, experiences, and efforts for integrating accessibility into everything that we all do in the music industry. We aren't just talking about artists or just about presenters, buyers, and promoters, not just about arts organizations and nonprofits, and not just about audiences and demography, but we want to approach this kind of all of the above in one fell swoop, helping all of us to craft a holistic, lowercase h, holistic approach to disability representation and accessibility in folk music. I'm really excited about our panel today and excited to learn from our panel today myself as a newbie to a disability myself. And we're going to approach these questions, again, not just as artists, but from the core idea that disabled folks, whether they're musicians, artists, creators, professionals, etc., disabled folks ought to be centered in any or all conversations surrounding accessibility, surrounding the climate crisis, surrounding equity, in all of our communities, and especially in our music communities. I wanted to make a note at the top of our panel today that we're going to be talking a lot about lived experiences today, and that's really valuable from the point of view of we aren't all of us just artists and creators. We're all also audience members. We're all also consumers. We're all also disabled people who live and work and function within this within the music industry. And so I wanted to make a note around lived experiences in that even though we're talking about these things from an intellectual point of view, these are real experiences that happen to real human beings on a daily basis, and they are often couched in emotion. And as viewers, especially as folks who might not be disabled, it's important to realize that these are real lived experiences of real human beings on a daily basis, not just intellectual ideas and not just concepts. Now, to get into our agenda, we've organized our conversation around three themes: the missing conversations, getting beyond good intentions, and folks' accessible future. Now, I'm really excited to introduce our panelists. And as I introduce each of our panelists today, they'll be giving you a brief visual description, and as well, they'll be answering a question. And before we do that, I'd like to note that my name is Justin Hiltner, and I am a white man with a particularly long pandemic curly hair right now, and I'm wearing a red flannel shirt. And so I'm going to go down and introduce our panelists, and as they give descriptions of themselves and answer this question, I'd invite our audience to ponder this question as well. With many conversations happening around accessibility in the arts, what do you see is being left out entirely, not discussed enough, or perhaps not being addressed as you would address it or as you have addressed it in the past? So to begin, I'm going to introduce Galen Lee. Galen Lee is a touring and recording artist, an advocate for disability rights and speaker. And I had the pleasure of first meeting and speaking to Galen Lee at Folk Alliance, actually, over the phone a few years ago. And I'm so glad that we are rejoined today by Galen Lee. Tell us your thoughts about this question, Galen.
Hello, my name is Galen Lee. I am a white woman with dark hair. I go by she, her, hers. Dark hair pulled up in two little pigtails and a purple clip in there, a stripy purple dress, and white skin. And I guess the missing conversation that I feel, or the way I wish it was approached differently when we talk about disability in the arts is right now where we're at, which I think is really important. We often talk about the barriers and the exclusion that people with disabilities face in the music industry, but I also want to talk about disabled art as an art form, like for the art's sake, and celebrating the art and how it is like a unique contribution to culture that is shaped partly by our experience as disabled people. And so not always discussing disability as an obstacle or a barrier or exclusion, but really just celebrating it. And I think we haven't quite gotten to that place yet. But I think there are enough, I think disabled artists personally often do feel that sense of celebration and pride, but I don't think it's translated into the mainstream yet, and or at least that's how I experience it. And so I would like to see more. Somebody said, this guy Velvet Cran one time said he wants it to be more of a party, and I think that eventually I would like to see that be the case. But I think we have a lot of work to get up to that point, and that's why we still need to have discussions like this about where we're getting left out or where there's barriers unnecessarily.
Yes,
yeah.
thank you for that, Galen. Justin speaking now. I so appreciate that, thinking about how these are lived experiences. Like, of course, these lived experiences would inform art. And why not talk about the ways that that art exists and what value it brings to our experiences by having that perspective of a disabled person having created it, but not that being the crux of the issue. Next, I want to introduce Lachi. Lachi is a recording artist, songwriter, film director, and novelist based in New York City. Welcome, Lachi. What do you think about this question?
Hello, Justin. Hi, I'm Lachi. I identify as she, her, hers. I am a brown-skinned Black woman with long curly hair, and I am wearing a white shirt. I am very excited to be here to discuss this topic. I think if we're going to talk about what context disability needs to be spoken in, which I recognize is not the exact question, but it's kind of where my mindset is. A lot of times people talk about diversity, and right now diversity is a very large topic. It's a hot topic, and people are talking about Black inclusion, Hispanic inclusion, LGBTQ inclusion. But when we talk about diversity, I don't see enough disability inclusion. So I'll see a very diverse panel covering all the basics. However, disability is not included in that. And one of the things that I ask any organization, I get very loud and rowdy when I see that. And their first response is, oh, well, then let's hold a disability discussion. And that's great. I love that they would love to host that. But then soon after, there's another diversity panel, and I still don't see disability on it. So I love having disability have its own space, but I think that we'll begin to start seeing that party that Galen mentioned, the party that you see celebrated by Black and brown people, the party that you see celebrated by the LGBTQ community, when we start being included in diversity and not something so other. And that's my response to that.
I really appreciate that response, Lachi. Justin speaking again. And I think that's right on the money. I feel like, as somebody who is newly disabled within the past couple of years and has had my awareness ratcheted up so quickly, it's something like you're always looking around the room and thinking, who's missing? And it's seemingly always disabled folks and Indigenous folks and trans folks, and the way that those identities intersect are not an accident, not a coincidence. Thank you so much for that perspective. Next, I want to introduce Tabby. Tabby is a songwriter, a singer, and a disability advocate. Welcome, Tabby. What do you think about this question? And thank you for introducing yourself.
Hi, yes, I am Tabby. I am a she, her, a singer-songwriter in New York City. I am Filipina and I wear glasses. I have brown hair, and you'll see my brown lapdog as well make a cameo. About the question, I agree with what everyone is saying, and I actually want to add to that about, the stigma. So, if we do raise our voices and talk about disability pride and disability equality in the arts, some immediately think about how is this going to be an accommodation request or a liability. So I definitely would like it to be more of an inclusive embrace as opposed to a taboo type of thing that's happening still today, unfortunately.
Yes, it's an unfortunate reality that disability issues are often just reduced to a budget line item, and it's not really seen as literally the way that somebody can enter a space. Being denied to somebody, they think of it as, well, can we afford the interpreter? Can we afford this? Can we take on the liability burden? But people aren't asking those same questions about able-bodied.
Right. I feel like we have to always be immediately on the defense, and I have to cover all the bases with one huge disclaimer instead of this one line item if this was something written or even verbal. I have to say my whole story and speak as fast as I can, like I'm presenting a pitch. And one day, hopefully, we won't have to do that.
Yes. Thank you so much for that perspective and that response, Tabby. Moving on, I want to introduce Gaby Castro. Gaby Castro is a singer-songwriter whose work focuses on feminism, self-empowerment, living with mental illness, and overcoming adversity. Welcome, Gaby. Please introduce yourself and let us know your thoughts on this question as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gaby Castro. I am a white Hispanic singer-songwriter. I have long curly brown hair and I have pale skin. And I am coming to you from Ohlone, Muwekma, and Chochenyo native land. I actually wrote a little bit about this, so I'll be speaking from an iPad. I believe a conversation that has been started in some places but needs to be addressed more is education around accessibility topics. I grew up with disabled family members with both invisible and visible disabilities, and learned from a young age that many people simply aren't educated in accessibility. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen people glare at my mom for parking in a disabled spot, putting her placard up, and walking out of the car without a cane or wheelchair. Just because someone doesn't look disabled doesn't mean they aren't. And there's also a lot of ableism in the way we speak. And while most people do not have bad intentions when using certain words or phrases, unfortunately, they do have ableist connotations, and we do need to have more discussions about this. I catch myself saying things like, wow, she's a psycho, or sorry, I totally spazzed out, or one of the really common ones, that's crazy. These phrases have become so ingrained in our vocabulary, and we need to talk about this more and find alternatives.
Yes, thank you for that response. Justin speaking again, I think that really resonates with me, speaking as somebody with a disability that's not visible and a disability that a lot of people see as an ability. It really resonates with me. Thank you for that perspective. Finally, I want to introduce our final panelist, Gabriel Rodrick, Freak. Creates music and art to remind us we do not have to conform to societal standards to be valued as human beings. Thank you for that, Gabriel, and welcome. What do you think of this first question? And please introduce yourself as well.
Thanks, Justin. My name is Gabriel Rodrick. I have short brown hair, a full short beard, and I'm wearing a green shirt, and I'm sitting in my room in South Minneapolis. I think I kind of want to piggyback on what the first three panelists said, that the conversation around artists and disabilities, I think, coming from my perspective as a person with a spinal cord injury, my community is so there are so many hermits, so many people who shut down after their injury and stay home and have a really hard time, like coming back into the world and kind of being reborn is probably the wrong term. But I know from a lot of people that I've connected with, that it's almost like this impossible thing to become an artist again post injury. And I think going back to what Galen was saying, like, make it a party, like make it accessible to the people who feel like it's just not even possible. Just like the idea of becoming an artist, not the space or, you know, whatever, just the idea of creating something and telling your story. If it was a party, if it was like, yeah, you could totally do that. Like, no question. You don't even have to think about it because other people are doing it. You know, all of us on this panel are doing it. I think that's a really beautiful message that isn't really out there right now.
I totally agree. Justin speaking again, that I loved that Lachi mentioned like the LGBTQ community and how it feels like a party, the confetti and the rainbows. And we think of Black communities and brown communities having such vibrant celebratory aspects of those communities, like centered. And disability is often, it lives in inspiration porn, the idea that, oh, how could someone disabled rise above this? Or it lives in sadness and darkness, and like how someone has created like a sort of Edgar Allan Poe-esque, like how did they create this beauty out of darkness? And it's such a backwards and broken way of thinking about it. And I think that it comes back to the fact that we, in this country and in most of the developed world, we've commodified music, and it's all through capitalism. And I see Galen's hand raised, and I'd like to throw this to Gaelynn because I see she's got a thought. Yes.
Well, thank you, this is Gaelynn. I just had an epiphany about this yesterday. And I think the reason this happens, what you're talking about, Justin, is the way we talk about it as overcoming or darkness or sadness or tragedy. I feel like where we're at right now is if you were to ask someone, give me a similar experience to being disabled, like think of a similar experience, there would not be a positive comparison. It would be like for the average American and probably other countries too, there wouldn't be like it would be some kind of hurdle or some sort of like other kind of tragedy. We would compare it to a tragedy, where I personally, from my lived experience, would compare it to another identity, like race or gender or like, you know, sexuality. And it doesn't mean that I think they're comparable, because they're not the same, but I see disability literally as a form of identity that you exist in the world. And I don't think that I would not compare it to an inherently negative experience. And I think there's a really big disconnect between the way that people who live with disability generally, or especially the advocates, I can't speak for everybody, of course, right? But if you see it as a form of your identity, as diversity, like Lachi said, as you see it as that, you wouldn't automatically compare it to something sucky like your house burning down. But I think a lot of people would still, and that's the problem. Like we really need to get to like, how do we change it? and make people realize that if you compare in your mind, if you think of disability from this lens of negativity, that you're not regarding our lives as equally valuable or even like with the same potential. And it's inherently damaging to look at disability through a negative lens like that.
Yeah.
And I think that is where the people sharing their experience and the education we provide around it and just visibility is so important, because I don't see that dialogue changing without people really actually having direct experience to learn about their biases.
Thank you for that point. I'm going to go to Gabriel, and then I will go to Lachi. Gabriel?
Yeah, I wanted to, again, kind of piggyback. From kind of a different perspective, I'm 12 years into my injury. And, that's how we see our disability. We see it as an injury. And I know for me, I see it as both. I see it as an identity that also doesn't define me, but it is a tragedy in my life. It is something that has been really difficult for me. And I have pulled a lot of my creative work from the darkness. But in pulling from the darkness, I've transformed it into beautiful things that have empowered me and made me feel like I did before my injury when I was writing music. It made me feel human. And I don't want to get too binary about it, because I think the struggle is so real and that needs to be known. But at the same time, it's not the only thing that should be known.
I appreciate that, because
they're both important.
Indeed. And we wouldn't ever want a disabled person's art to be reduced to their disability. It still includes their disability, and it doesn't exist in a vacuum apart from someone's identity. I want to go to Lachi really quickly, and then I'll go to Gaelynn. Lachi, what did you have for us on this thought?
This thought, so very quickly, I think I have a slightly different perspective. I don't necessarily see my disability as a bad thing. I actually see it as a good thing. If I was just some Black girl running around, then it's like, oh, look, another Black girl singing. I actually wear it as a badge of honor. People can take this however they want, but my whole stance is, and I did it blind. What are you doing with your life? So I take it to that effect. And I'm going to give you a quick example. Someone the other day, because we're starting this huge YouTube series on the fact that I'm legally blind, and I just recently got this diagnosis that's going to take me from low vision to no vision in a couple of years. So we're doing a whole YouTube series following me around. It was funny. One of the brands we reached out to was like, you have such a really well-oiled team. Like, can you tell me more about your team? And I was like, yeah, my manager is super accomplished. He's run huge tours. My new brand agent, she's just got this big deal where she's got all this money coming in for her clients. And I was like, my admin assistant is a rock star. You're just an admin. This guy is like insanely good. And then my intern, just as an intern, she's awesome. And I was like, my team is like, you wish you had my team. And they're like, yeah, that's awesome. And I was like, oh yeah, and we're all blind. So that, and she was like, what? You're all blind? In fact, she was just like, what? You're all blind? And I was like, yeah, we're all blind. And we're all very accomplished in what we do. And personally, I find that as a point of pride, not as a point of weakness. I love when the folks around me walk in like, can we say badasses on here? We walk in like badasses, and you don't even have to know we're blind. And once you find out, you're like, holy crap, I wish I was in that crew. And that's sort of the persona that I like to put forth. I find it as a point of pride. And my whole goal is for everybody to feel the way I feel about my disability.
That's great. And I love the radical agency and autonomy that you're expressing through that. Like, I'm doing this on my terms. We're doing this on our terms, whether you know that or not. That's how we're operating. Gaelynn, what did you have on this thought as well?
Well, I just think that the last 5 minutes, in case you weren't listening, really like encapsulates how different disability experiences can be. And that's so important to acknowledge that, like, I don't want to speak for Gabriel, of course. Like, I see it as like, let's all party together as a disabled identity, and like, yeah, but like there is this truth that people come at it from different places in life and at different times, and it can be difficult. I mean, my disability just on its own, it poses more health issues at certain times than others. When I break bones, for example, I can't do a lot of the stuff that I usually do, and so I think it's important to acknowledge that, and maybe that's why I like the idea of disability. There's a story, and I'll go really quick. Somebody with my disability was found a prehistoric skeleton of somebody with my disability, and they had determined that the only way that person lived is if somebody had been willing to carry them around. Way back when we never assumed there was like altruism back then, and I think we need to. I want to start talking about disability as a natural form of human diversity, so that it doesn't have to be quite so binary, so that it can be like everybody. I don't know. I know why we label things, but I think that at this point in our society, it's kind of to our detriment in some ways to say this body is able-bodied and this body is disabled, because then we can't just be our own experiences and then have our own views about those experiences. Because I don't want to speak for other people when I think about my disability. So at least acknowledging that we're not going to all be coming from the same point of view is a first step, but then realizing that human bodies are just all over the map, and it changes our experience of the world, and that's totally normal, like totally 100% how it's always been.
Perfectly human, exactly. And one thing that I came to mind for me, actually, from our conversation, Gaelynn, when we first spoke years ago, when I was first disabled, was if a human being lives long enough, they'll be lucky enough to be disabled. And it's just a fact of human life. I want to go to Tabby and Gaby on this question as well. Let's start with you, Tabby, and then we'll get Gaby.
Yes, so I agree with what they're saying with Lachi and Gaelynn talking about how, you know, the disability we have also has been a little bit part of what makes us stand out. And with Gabriel saying about recognizing the difficult times, and then that hybrid together, back again to what everyone has been saying about the other types of diversity groups like LGBTQ and Black lives. It's about going through that struggle and embracing it, and then uniting together to make the change, because there's so many things that we can help make this be a party. Like glamour, make the artistry be a glamour. How is it glamorous if I tell another prospective artist that we cannot go into the dressing room because it's downstairs in the basement or upstairs, no elevator? Or how can I tell them it's great to be an artist when I can barely get onto the stage? So things like that really can help make this appealing to more artists that are considering being an artist just because, I mean to say that they're debating it because of the hardship.
Right, the perceived barriers or the real barriers, and there are so many. Gaby, how about you on this question? I know you had a thought you'd like to share.
Yes. So going off what pretty much everyone's been saying, what I've come to realize as someone who has depression and anxiety and also suffered an injury about 3 years ago, it was basically an ankle sprain, but unfortunately something happened with the pain receptors in my body, and I have pain to the point where it feels like my ankle was pretty much crushed in a car accident. I've come to realize that everyone in the disability community, we all see things differently. And I think everyone's viewpoints are extremely valid, that you can see it as a tragedy or you can see it as a badge of honor, or you can see it as both. I just think it's really important for people who may not be in the disability community to be aware of that.
I really appreciate that. And something that it reminds me of as a queer person is the concept of queerness, not only with a capital Q, but also a lowercase q. The idea that like queer people bring a perspective that queers reality. And that's what disabled folks do as well. When we approach reality as disabled folks, and reality changes to meet our needs, not vice versa. And that's a really amazing thing. And so we wouldn't ever want to remove all of these diverse ways of experiencing being from the human experience. It adds value, it doesn't detract. Lachi?
I just had one super quick thing I wanted to say. This is Lachi. And you guys can correct me, you folks can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel there's a school of thought that's trying to do away with the terminology able-bodied and trying to introduce the term non-disabled instead, because for folks that have invisible or non-visible disabilities, they would not consider themselves non-able-bodied. So there is an exclusion factor there when you refer to non-disabled people as able-bodied. So I've heard that that's a school of thought that's slowly being argued in by the advocates and activists. So I just wanted to make folks aware of that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Did you have something, Gaelynn?
No, I like that a lot. I always, it's one of those things that kind of makes it in 40% of the time, but you're like, yes, I totally resonate with that.
I was coming
totally
at you,
agree.
by the way.
No, Lachi, thank you for making that point. Because for me, you know, being recently disabled, the thing that's most fascinating to me on a daily basis is reckoning with my own internalized ableism, and how Gaby made the point earlier, how it's embedded into everything we do, even our vernacular and our vocabulary. And so it's really important. Words matter, especially in you know, when I woke up disabled after my cancer surgery. I already had a wealth of negative feelings towards my own embodiment in my subconscious, and I didn't have any of the positive ones. And so that's why we're talking about these sort of things through lived experiences, but also like the really important details and the really important like minutia of ableism, because it impacts all of us. I wanted to go to you, Gaby, and ask you a question kind of along the lines of what you were talking about earlier with education. And I'll take this question to the whole panel, but I wanted to start with you, Gaby. While education and awareness continues around accessibility, and all of these sort of companies and programs and organizations are innovating and improving accessibility, what are, I guess, some of the practical or like, I guess, what are some of the solutions that you see to helping folks unlock their own empathy or their own awareness around disability and around identity? Because for so many people, it takes that sort of glass shattering moment for them to relate to disability. And we wouldn't want to wish disability on anyone to have that moment. So how do we bridge that gap? And I'll start with Gaby and then we'll go around. What are your thoughts?
Wow. Well, let's see. I grew up pretty much surrounded by people who had disabilities. So I guess I always had a different perspective that as long as you know someone with a disability, you'll have like a way of understanding. But then I realized that there are people who don't know people with disabilities, or they may not know that the person they know has a disability.
Right.
So I think it's just reaching out and just reaching out into your communities and just becoming more aware. I found Twitter is an excellent resource. There are some incredible disability advocates out there. I follow Alice Wong. She is a San Francisco-based disability activist, and she also edited a book of essays. I have it on my nightstand. It's called Disability Visibility. And I mean, I think ultimately it just comes down to have empathy. You need to make the effort. You need to become more aware of your surroundings and also see people with disabilities as humans. We're just like you. We're just a little different, and so is everyone.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Tabby, I wondered if you would have any thoughts on this sort of question. Oh, I'm so glad that your lapdog is making a cameo as well.
Thank you. No, I agree with what they're saying, and with when it comes to those kinds of things, I think about my own situation all the time, and how whenever I am in a place of like an artistic situation, I'm like, how do we need to think outside of just ourselves? And I have even seen theaters that are not, accommodating, and it's made me really, really, really worried about what other levels of accommodation are not being brought here.
Right. If a venue isn't ADA accessible from its front door, then what are the other sort of things they aren't keeping in mind? It's a great litmus test, but it's a bad litmus test.
It's like a moment of truth, where we have all of these pretenses we're coming in with, and now we're having a pretense based on what we are experiencing in the moment.
Yeah. Gaelynn, I wanted to go to you next. What do you think on this question for establishing empathy?
I think that at this point in time, 30 years after the ADA became law, I think we have to, of course, have representation so that people can learn, like, about the humans behind the law, right? But I think at this point also, I know this sounds kind of contradictory or whatever, but I feel that it sort of has to go beyond empathy to responsibility at this point. Like, I personally have been calling for a long time for non-disabled artists to start refusing to play at inaccessible venues, because it shouldn't be just on me and Lachi and Tabby and Gabriel and Gaby to worry about that. That should be like, okay, I have a part to play in this injustice, and maybe to be a little more, like, maybe the empathy part of it comes in at being a little more honest about what it actually means if you're choosing to not take any responsibility for accessibility. Like, you're a folk artist and you still play at inaccessible venues. I don't know, because Tabby and I, for example, we did a show together in New York, and it was at a venue that was supposedly accessible, but really the bathrooms weren't actually ADA compliant, even though we were told that they were. The stage ramp that they got really wasn't safe, so we ended up playing on the floor, actually, because it was just so dangerous. And then the green room was upstairs, so we couldn't go to the green room, right? And I ended up getting my makeup on before the show in the mop closet, putting my makeup on, like, where there's a curtain, mops, me there, putting on my makeup and hearing the audience, like, literally on the other side of the curtain. And I was like, no other artist would think this is cool if this was happening to them, but they still play here because they don't actually think about what it would be like to have to get ready for a show. And I mean, that's like, wah, wah, boo, boo, I get to play a show. Like, I understand that I'm lucky that I get to perform, but the level, like, it's very second class citizen kind of thing right now, where we're at, like, with accessibility. Disabled artists often don't get their basic, the same basic treatment or needs met, and they have to do a lot more work to even get the show, because they have to make sure that it's, like, baseline going to work for them. And I just think that if other artists really want to empathize, it has to cause some practical change, because I think 30 years after the ADA, we're a little bit beyond, oh, I feel bad for you, but I'm still going to play at these crappy venues, you know? So empathy equals action, in my opinion.
I'm really grateful that you frame it that way. Empathy as a tool for responsibility instead of as an end result, especially since we all know that empathy can often be very ableist when people are empathizing with the, ableist narratives around us. And I think that it's such an interesting point too, Gaelynn, when we have the green M&M trope in music for a reason, right? If somebody doesn't get the green M&Ms on their rider, they storm out. Of course, a disabled person isn't going to storm out if their bare minimum rider isn't met. It's not met for most gigs that disabled folks play. And so I'm really glad that you frame it that way. Lachi, do you have any thoughts on empathy and responsibility?
I do. And it's, I laughed because Galen mentioned the laws and she said, we need to know the humans behind it. I know that she wasn't intending to reference Judy Heumann, but it made me smile. Gaby mentioned earlier, Alice Wong. And I think another really great name that folks should know on Twitter and beyond is Judy Heumann. She's definitely one of the pioneers of a lot of the laws that have gotten passed. And she's having a new podcast. Is it Beyond Human is the name of her book. The name of the podcast is The Human Perspective. So clever. And so definitely check that out when it comes out. I know that I'll be on one of the first episodes. But when as it pertains to empathy, I feel that representation is the key. When people, for the first time, a lot of people, the first time they saw someone of a different race was on TV or on a movie screen. The first time they even knew that, a gay person could be funny and cool was, Will and Grace, or maybe their first play that they went to or something of that nature. And they had no idea until they saw it on either the big screen or read about it in a major article. And we just don't have that. Only about 2 to 3.5% of lead roles depict a person with any form of disability. And even less than that are folks of a multi-margin, so a different race. And get this, only 12% are played authentically. So I call that, first of all, this is my own little side note, but when a non-disabled person plays a disabled person on television, I call that disability face, and I compare it similar to blackface. So next, empathy comes with representation. I believe the more we begin to see folks in high places with disabilities and folks not only on the screen, but behind the scenes, being the writers and being the producers and being the ones in the know to bring in the right actors for these roles or the right this or that's for these roles, we'll begin to see more empathy. I myself have begun doing a lot of work within the Recording Academy to start getting some more initiatives regarding artists with disabilities sort of recognized. There's been a lot of movement for color. There's been a lot of movement for different sexual identities, but there hasn't been a lot of movement for disability. And when I first mentioned it, they were like, who in the Grammys? We don't know anyone with a disability. And I said, here's 40 names. So I think that folks just aren't exposed. And it's not necessarily because we're not exposing ourselves.
Exactly.
It's about having the intention to expose that culture. When Hollywood and when the music industry acts with intention to bring us in, we will be there in droves and we will make that empathy. We just need stage, no pun intended, but we just need that stage. And that's where the empathy comes.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's such a great response to this question. I wanted to go to you as well, Gabriel, and see if you had any thoughts in your own experience around empathy and how that translates to responsibility.
Yeah. I mean, asking for empathy is hard. I mean, the culture that we live in, it's the power dynamics that exist in this country are so ingrained, and so asking for empathy it seems impossible sometimes. And the thing that keeps popping into my head during this conversation is like, we just have to burst through the doors. We have to make ourselves known. We have to speak loudly. We have to make really cool stuff. I was gonna curse, but then I didn't. and it's a really complicated balance of the community doing it for themselves. Like, we're here. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna go play at the Cedar Cultural Center, even though their stage isn't accessible. I'm gonna get lifted up onto the stage. I'm just gonna do this. I'm gonna go out and make it happen. But then there is also like an expectation that you should hold on venues and gatekeepers to be like, yo, why aren't you making this accessible for us? I think we, for me, it's that's been my strategy, is like, I'm just gonna bull rush into wherever I can and make it happen.
Yeah.
And in doing that, you start to create relationships, and as soon as you start creating relationships with people, that's when the empathy is triggered.
Yep.
And that's I think it's a really hard thing to do, but I think without like a relationship to the community, to the people, empathy it's empty, it's false, it's hollow. Yeah. And so that's why I just have this image of just like, we just gotta be out there. We just gotta do it.
I love that. And I think that it's, again, what I feel is being like reiterated back to me as moderator is just that the agency and autonomy of disabled folks is where the value is. And equipping disabled folks to exercise their agency and autonomy artistically is what we should all be asking ourselves. Are we helping? Are we accomplices? Are we allies in this on a daily basis? And most of us are not. Gaelynn, I see your hand. What have you got?
I just wanted to add that 2020 was such a, well, for obvious reasons, a difficult year on basically every front. But one of the things that was hard for me was I was so excited for the 30th anniversary of the ADA. I was like, this is the year we're going to bust into the mainstream and it's going to be amazing. And then about a billion things happened where it just didn't really come to fruition. But I am starting, like Lachi, in different avenues, trying to have conversations with people at these bigger publications who have more, like, pretty big influence. I mean, I don't have the influence, but I'm like, hey, why aren't we regularly covering disability outside of the month of July when the ADA was signed? Why aren't we featuring disabled artists consistently, and in a platform? I must say, I think the beginning stages is when people do host disability forums or whatever, but they don't put them front and center of the conference, right? Mm-hmm. I'm talking when are we going to have that year where this is now the conversation that we are having, and it's not an optional, you can attend on the side. And I think we're going to get there. I actually feel like in the next 5 years, people are receptive because of the terrible stuff that happened with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter. I think people kind of realize, whoa, I don't have all the information, and I need to start listening and just taking it in and then acting in the way that the Black community, let's take their lead because we are off base. I think that was good for humanity to kind of just admit maybe where just how messed up stuff is. And I think that has made people a little more sensitive, at least in my experience now, to be bringing up hey, let's talk about maybe we realize that we're not the expert in any experience except for one we have directly lived. So we have to let people who have directly lived that experience take the reins. And I hope that happens for disability in the next few years. I feel like there's a chance that it will. It's hopeful. I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts to that.
I wanted to go to Tabby. Tabby had a thought, and then to Lachi. Tabby.
Yeah, so of course, Gaelynn, I definitely have a thought about that. It's, be a pioneer and let's take every opportunity you know, that comes our way where we have the platform to help speak up for ourselves or others. So actually something that, you know, Gabriel mentioned about, you know, really bringing the empathy and being personable, you know, with someone. I recall now about when I was in my university and the stage was not accessible, so I could not perform in my choir. So what ended up happening was that I had to talk to stage managers who told me the process, write a letter to someone in the main office who handles the theater. We would love if you would do this. This would benefit us too, because, you know, with equipment. So, I mean, I wonder what your thoughts are with that too. Like, how about relating to non-disabled persons? What ended up happening was not only did my getting the stage to be accessible by crying to the president of my university in his face by joining student government to get the opportunity to speak with him. But it allowed the stage managers to benefit from moving things to the stage. And then it benefited even people in politics to use the stage for like the national conventions.
Yeah, I think that you make such an excellent point, especially as the coronavirus shows us that the world is willing to do accessibility if it works for them. Zoom is allowed if it works for them, like conferencing in if it works for non-disabled folks. I thank you for that framing. We're coming to the end, and I want to get Lachi's thoughts on this question before I open up our last question. So Lachi, briefly, did you want to have contribute as well on this point?
Yeah, for sure. This is Lachi speaking. I did want to say, well, quickly on your point about Zoom, it's funny because it's still relatively inaccessible.
Exactly.
Or like Clubhouse, which is this new audio only app. And so blind folks are all going, wow, this is going to be amazing for us. Meanwhile, it's 100% inaccessible. So the reason why I raised my hand is because Galen did make an excellent point about we need to get on the main stage and start speaking to major level situations to really kind of have a wide berth with the conversation. And so I did want to say that I know that the Recording Academy had actually asked me to put together a program for disability, and they wanted to have it in just the sort of New York area. And I said, nope. I'm not going to do it unless it's on the national website and to the national membership. And so we will be actually having a national panel on music and disability at the Grammys, like for the Recording Academy. And also, while I'm saying that, I do want to say any musician that's watching this that thought to themselves, oh, the Grammys, it's really snobby or whatever, please come join my fight. I am really literally doing this by myself, and everyone's going, wow, this is amazing. And I'm trying to tell them that there are tons of us. So I just want to throw that out there. If we, like Gabriel said, we just really got to put ourselves out there. And it's one thing when you put yourself out there by yourself, but when you put yourself out there as a group, you really do make an impact. So I am making a slight plug and implore.
No, I'm so glad you did. You're segueing us perfectly, Lachi. That is excellent. I want to mention that not only is this panel and are these panelists doing so much labor today, but what Tabby's describing, what Lachi's describing, what each of these panelists is describing is so much mental and emotional and physical and intellectual labor that they are all doing for free. We are all doing for free on top of what we already do. And that is not nothing. And so I just wanted to name that as I realized that being spoken into this, all of us, it's not a coincidence that most of the folks on this panel also are listing activist in their bios as well. We're doing so much of this labor, and I don't want that to go unnamed. So for our final question, we have about 5 minutes. I'd like you each to speak briefly about your hope for the future. And I know that's such a big question, so maybe let's keep it to one sentence. Your hope, one or two, for the folk music community's future and accessibility. I'm going to start with Gaby. Gaby, your thoughts?
Well, my hope is that we keep connecting, we keep an open mind and an open heart, and we just stay open to knowing that this is an ever-changing thing, and really we can only go up from here.
Thank you for that. Gabriel, I'd like to go to you next. What are your final thoughts as we close this conversation?
Yeah, I think my hope for the future is that people with disabilities, artists with disabilities, understand that we have a lot of power. We have a lot of energy. We have so much to give, so much story to tell. And I think it's just sitting, waiting for us. And I think we should go grab it together.
Yes, that radical agency, express it. Tabby, what are your hopes for the future?
I can't wait to see the day when I don't have to call a place like 10 times to verify whether or not I can get in as an audience member and then as an artist. And maybe that number will decrease and eventually get to 0.
I'm going to look directly in the camera and say, if you are a presenter or run a venue or a festival, we're speaking to you. Galen Lee, I would love to hear your thoughts and your hopes for the future.
My hopes for the future are that anyone listening, whether you're a disabled artist or presenter or a non-disabled artist and presenter, that you'll realize the value of having not just different kinds of voices and different perspectives in our culture. So it's worth fighting for and doing the work just to make our culture more rich and diverse, but also that a welcoming society for people with disabilities definitely bleeds over into every other group. So if we make the world more accessible, it's just going to be that much cooler for everyone, whether or not you're disabled, or maybe you develop a disability later in life, or your niece ends up being born with a disability. Or whether or not you just want to lug a bunch of boxes up a stage and you want to use the ramp. I mean, there's just so many ways that making an accessible world really does just make the world cooler for everyone. And if we start realizing that, we can fight for it even if it doesn't directly impact us. And that's what I want to see for the future.
Snaps for that. Excellent. Lachi, I didn't mean to give you the last position and to do the bulk of the lifting here, but bring us home, Lachi. What are your thoughts, your hope for the future?
All right. Well, I want to speak not to the people who have empathy, but to the people who don't have empathy, to the fat cats who actually really do run the world. I want to talk to you because you're the ones with the money and the purchasing power, right? So the Ruderman Family Foundation, they put together a pledge where they said, hey, different production companies, I want you to start having more folks with disabilities in your TV shows. And guess what? CBS signed that pledge. NBC signed that pledge. And the disability community, we need pledges like that. We need to start a pledge that says, hey, different venues, you need to sign these pledges so that you can say, hey, we're going to be more accessible. And then you're going to be a more elite venue. Why did NBC sign that? Why did CBS sign that? Well, because like Gabriel said, guess what? We have power. The disability community has power. And I don't just mean, oh my God, we have power. I mean, we have purchasing power. We literally have 1 trillion. I know that's a weird, very round number, but that's what the articles say. We have $1 trillion in our personal purchasing power and the people that we influence. So while you're kicking yourself going, oh man, I should have got into Bitcoin, or oh man, I should have gotten into Dogecoin, you're going to wish you got into disability coin. And because we have $1 trillion in purchasing power, we have that influence, and you are missing out if you don't.
We hate that we have to play by capitalist rules, but we do get to play by capitalist rules, and our money does have power and our agency has power. And that is not something that we should ever discount. I want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists for being here today. Thank you for bringing your whole selves to this conversation. It's meant so much to me, and I know it's meant so much to Folk Alliance and to our audience as well. That's our time today, but I know that we have Amy right now, or Jacobs, who will be joining us again to say goodbye. My name is Justin Hiltner. I've enjoyed this so much. It's such an honor and pleasure to get to sit here in this virtual roundtable format with all of these amazing experts on disability and accessibility. Oh, Amy, I think you're muted.
There we go. This is Amy. Thank you to all of our amazing panelists today and to our wonderful moderator, Justin Hiltner. This session will continue to be available as a recording on the Folk Unlocked platform all week. Please take a moment to provide feedback about today's conversation by posting comments in the chat. Finally, Folk Unlocked is made available at a pay-what-you-can price point, thanks to the generosity of our donors. If you could take a moment to support our work, donations can be made at folk.org/donate. Stay safe and stay connected, community. We'll see you soon.